It's the best of time and it's the worst of time. It seems India is standing on the cusp of another reform movement. To talk to me on the economic issues and other related policy, I have with me Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. Welcome to DD News, sir.
Yes.
So first question on the reform movement. We saw lots of reform past month on the 14th of September, then 4th of October. So what's your view on that? Will they help India regain its growth trajectory?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, these are not completely new in the sense that many of them have been in the pipeline, and some of them had run into some political opposition. So the government, quite rightly, I think, decided that they would like to consult more widely. So there was a period when we were consulting, hoping to get people to agree to the reforms. I don't think everybody has agreed, but the government has very rightly said that these are necessary for India's growth revival. Now we're having consulted enough, we are going to go ahead with doing the reforms. And there's lots more that needs to be done. I think both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister have made it clear that if India is to regain the kind of 8% or maybe even higher growth rate that we want, then this is only one set of steps. We have to continue doing more in the years ahead.
So steps like what, in a sense?
Well, I think in the most immediate future, I think we need to get back the momentum of project implementation in the critical infrastructure sectors of energy. I don't think you can get high growth if the prospect is that we cannot manage our energy situation. There were implementation problems. We've set up a mechanism that will try to accelerate these projects. Number of steps have been taken. Coal India is going to sign fuel supply agreements. Hopefully they will be importing some coal to make up the deficiency. They're looking at new innovative ways of exploiting their own mines, maybe even doing some PPP in those areas. Many steps are in the process.
So there was talk about the National Investment Board, but it seems it has run into some rough weather. And is it nice to create a single window to solve all the infrastructure problems?
No, I don't think it's a single window to solve all problems. I think it's an extremely important initiative. When you say rough weather, any change involves people expressing a view. So this is a very innovative, very different way of doing things. All we know is that some ministries are not convinced. This will now go to the cabinet, and hopefully a view will be taken at that level. In my view, the present system is dysfunctional, and we should have a system like this. Now, let me say that the intention is not to ignore the ministries that are currently processing for approval. Rather, it is to take a holistic view so that all factors can be kept in mind. So the ministries that are responsible for these clearances, they will have their full say. But the final decision will be taken by a board in which other ministers will also be present.
But sir, whenever there is a talk of big infrastructure programs or setups, there is always hurdles from the environmental ministry. There is difficulty in getting the environmental clearance. Do you think, is it possible? You also said in a recent interview that we'll get environmental clearances very fast soon.
Well, certainly the intention is to speed up this process. I'm not saying, by the way, that this board should just blindly give environmental clearances. Rather, the present system, what happens is that when applications are being moved, there's not enough sense of urgency. And also, very often, when something is not acceptable, the ministry simply says it's not acceptable. Whereas what we need to do is to find a problem-solving approach, that if this is not acceptable, could a modified version of it become acceptable? I think that concern will get more attention if you have a board. And my view is that if the board is there, the ministry itself will take a little more proactive approach. See, at the moment, there is no expectation that the Environment Ministry or the forest people have to solve problems. The approach rather is, if it doesn't meet the criteria, then it just shouldn't be approved. Now, the problem is many of these criteria are arbitrary, they're not necessarily scientific, and certainly if you take into account a trade-off, a somewhat different view can be taken. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that we should in any way ignore the environmental consideration, but I believe that a better balance of how to achieve the objectives will come if we have such a board.
Now coming back to reforms, sir, the Planning Commission has kept the growth rate for this financial year at around 6%. Will these reform unleash the animal spirit, so to say, or increase the growth from above 6%?
Well, I think actually the reforms are not designed to impact the current year's growth. I mean, it's quite clear that the current year's growth is going to be a little low. We haven't actually said 6%. I think the last official estimate from the Reserve Bank was 6.5. That may look difficult right now. So I'm quite happy with saying anywhere between 6 and 6.5. But the important thing is half the year is already over. So these reforms are really meant to essentially turn the economy around. And you know, a little bit there is evidence that some turning around is taking. Some positive news is coming, but it's not strong enough. So we need to do a lot more.
So turn the economy around, some positive news, but last week we saw a threat of a rating downgrade by S&P, saying that there is a 1 in 3 chance of a downgrade. What's your view on that?
You know, let's put it this way, the ratings issue has always been in the background. And I think the last time around, the ratings agency some months ago had shifted our grade. They hadn't altered the investment grade, but they changed it from stable to negative outlook. Now, that obviously is an indication that there are some problems, and that unless these problems are addressed, they may well think of a downgrade. But since that was done, a number of steps have been taken. Finance Minister has, I think in Tokyo, addressed some of these issues, and he has expressed the view, and I agree with that I do not think that there is a case for a downgrade. I think the rating agencies will recognize that since they did the last assessment, the things have only improved. I think they themselves say that. So the real question is, will they change the grading from negative to neutral or not? I don't know, but I don't expect them to worsen the situation.
But leaving aside rating agency, even the international organizations like IMF and World Bank are very pessimistic. IMF had lowered our growth rate to 4.9%, which is like below 5%.
Well, let me say the IMF is very pessimistic about the whole world. I mean, they have actually lowered everybody's growth rate. They are pessimistic about Europe. Their projection for Brazil is less than 2%. Their projection for Russia is about 3+%. And so they've given the number, I know, of 4.9 for India. But you know, frankly, I think that's partly because they go on the basis of market price data. And in the last quarter for India, the market price factor cost data was very different. So I personally think there's some error in the data. Probably the growth rate this year, somewhere between 5.5 and 6, would have been a much more reasonable number. You know, already if you go by market price, in the first 6 months we've done 5.4. I believe that we will see a turnaround. So we should do better than 5.4. So I think 4.9 is, in my view, not going to be the final number at all. But remember, the IMF is not making an India forecast. They're doing a global forecast.
So we saw a floodgate of reforms, 14th of September, 4th of October, FDI in many sectors. So why now, after 9 years? They could have taken all these measures when we were recording a good healthy growth. We recorded 6.5 in the last fiscal, first 5.5 in the first quarter of this fiscal, but we also recorded 9.28%. We could have taken these steps earlier.
No, if you're saying, I hope you're not saying that these are not good reforms.
I'm saying these are reforms are nice.
Done it
earlier.
Well, you know, let's be clear, as I told you right at the beginning, I think these are excellent measures. They were very much in the pipeline. But you know, the government is running a coalition, and it's one thing to announce what reforms you want to do, but it's important to try to get a political consensus. Now, if you can't get a political consensus, then you have to do what you think is right. But I think it makes sense to invest some time in discussion, so nobody should be able to say that you're doing all these things and not even consulting us. I mean, the FDI in retail was more or less done much earlier. There was a protest, so the government consciously decided to say, okay, we'll hold it back.
So that means good economics is bad politics, or good politics is bad economics.
Well, you know, I think it's very important for our political class, if you like, both the government and the opposition, but mainly the opposition, to realize that, you know, in a democracy, it is the business of the opposition to oppose. And that opposition serves a very useful purpose, question, etc. But mere obstructive opposition for the sake of opposing actually delays good things. That's not for me to say, but I think, I believe that in a healthy democracy, good economics should be converted into good politics. Doesn't always happen. I should add, by the way, that this is not just a unique Indian problem. If you go around the world, I mean, all governments are finding themselves politically stuck in one thing or another. So there's a bit of a lesson in this for the political system.
So talking about FDI in retail, very contentious issue, but how will it benefit the Indian masses?
Well, I think when you say it's a contentious issue, it's been made a
opposition.
Contentious issue by the opposition. I mean, there's innumerable studies, research, etc., all of which shows that modern retail is going to be good for the country, is going to be good for the farmers, because, you know, at the moment we have a very old-fashioned retailing system with very little investment in the logistic chain from the farmer to the consumer. And as a result, there's a lot of wastage, a lot of build-up of charges, middlemen adding their costs. The farmer gets too low a price, the consumer pays too high a price. Now, the modernization of retail will actually compress this, and the hope is that the farmer will get a higher price, the consumer will get a lower price, more assurance of quality, etc. Now, modern retail was opened up almost 20 years ago, and we have seen a build-up of modern Indian retailing, which is good. But, you know, it didn't lead to much investment in the back end. They didn't put in enough into the logistics, supply chain, cold storages, etc. Opening up modern retail to FDI is being done basically to inject an element of modernization and also to push investment into the supply, into the backward end of the supply chain. It will only help the modern retailing sector. I completely disagree with those who say that this will hurt small retailers. It will not. In a fast-growing economy, the total size of the market is going to expand. Modern retail in India is only 6%, and it will take several years before it reaches even 15, 20%. And what we're doing is not unique to India. Every other emerging market country is doing it. So those who oppose it should address this question and ask people in the whole world, I mean, ask their audience, do they believe that every other country has got it wrong? I mean, I think that's just a nonsensical position, quite frankly. I mean, I can see that you want to make a political point, you make a political point. I think what the minister has done is extremely sensible, because what he's done is he finds a difference of view. Some chief ministers want modern retail. They believe it's good for the farmers, it's good for the consumers. Some do not. So what he says is, okay, we leave it to the states. I believe that if some chief ministers want FDI in retail and others don't, the latter should not have a veto on the former. Let the states differ. Let some states bring in these new retailers and we'll see what the results are. That's the only sensible way of proceeding.
So any other benefit of FDI in retail, like job creation or
increases in tax? I think certainly there'll be job. Actually, what will happen in my view is that, you know, when you upgrade retailing, it's a complete mistake to think of the jobs that are created in the retail shop, because the modernization of retail is creating a back-end structure, a logistic structure. The actual retail shop may employ even fewer people, but, you know, it'll contract out a lot of employment. For example, in a very small retail store, the person who's employed running the store is also the one doing the cleaning. In a modern retail, cleaning will be outsourced to someone else. The person who's actually doing the sales will not actually be doing the cleaning of the store. Somebody else will be doing the. All these studies that you see, that a Walmart will replace, it just misses these points. So in fact, if you look at it seriously, every modernization involves an increase in productivity. That means per person, you generate more value. For the same value, you obviously have fewer people. But that is not, that is never used as a reason to argue against productivity. I think we should see it. You will see it's positive. It will create jobs. More importantly, it will create better quality jobs. You know, a lot of the employment that's created in what you might call the small kirana store is not what I would call high quality employment. That's not what our young people are looking for. They're looking for better quality employment. And my guess is that in modern retail, the quality of employment will be much better. It will also be more organized, you'll be able to protect labor rights, etc., etc.
So since FDI in retail is allowed, will we see deluge of dollars now?
Will be what?
Deluge of dollars. I mean, all these...
Deluge of dollars?
Yes,
well,
sir.
you know, look, inflows of foreign capital is a reflection of a total perspective on the economy, not by any one thing. Our objective is to show through a series of reforms, including the steps that the finance minister is taking on fiscal consolidation, that the Indian economy is well managed. I am absolutely certain that if that impression is created, you'll see an inflow of capital. We need an inflow of capital. We need to invest, we need to find more money to put into all our different sectors, particularly our infrastructure. So somehow deluge makes it look like an undesirable flow. I think what you will get is the kind of flow we need to support the kind of economic activity that we're looking for.
So talking about inflation, inflation has also been a big issue. What's your comfort level, in a sense, Planning Commission or the government's comfort level? We have seen high inflation level, lots of...
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that inflation has been higher than what we would regard as comfortable or what the finance ministry would regard as comfortable. You know, people vary in what they regard as comfortable. I mean, typically the Reserve Bank would probably say that, you know, maybe 3 to 4% inflation. Perhaps the finance ministry would say 4 to 5%. Planning Commission traditionally has been willing to tolerate a little bit more, so we generally say 5 to 6%. And I think the 10-year record of inflation averages about 6%. So I'm saying it should be below 6%. It is not at the moment below 6%, it's above 7%. But the important thing is it's coming down. It was double digit, it's not double digit now. And my expectation is that with good supply side response and good production, I expect to see a gradual softening in the rate of inflation.
So diesel prices were increased. So you think the effect of rise in diesel prices would add up to inflation? And
not at all. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that people make. And the reason, I think Swaminathan Iyer in a very nice article explained all this quite well. A lot of people think that by keeping diesel prices low, you keep inflation low. But that misses an important point. What is the consequence of keeping diesel prices low? It is that you ruin your oil sector or you force the government to give a huge subsidy. Either of those has very damaging effects on the economy. It has a damaging effect on expectations. If you start financing large oil subsidies, the fiscal deficit goes up, people's perceptions of India changes, the rupee will depreciate, money will go out of the country. Now all of that is going to actually lead to more inflation. So the arithmetical calculation that you raise the diesel price, therefore you've raised inflation, I would respectfully say is wrong. And that, as a matter of fact, if they had not raised the diesel price, it's quite likely that you would have got more inflation because you would have generated very negative expectations about the economy.
So what's your recipe for growth? I mean, a good growth with low inflation.
I think, you know, the difference really is the relationship between growth and inflation depends on whether you're talking about the growth potential or you're talking about output independent of potential. Now, in the Planning Commission, what we are trying to do is to create an environment where India's growth potential increases. So instead of the economy growing at whatever 5 or 6%, it grows at 8 or 9%. That kind of effort, which focuses on the supply side, is always good for inflation. What is not good for inflation is if you don't have the potential, but you keep jacking up demand in the hope that output will respond. There you get an increase in output in the short run, but accompanied by inflationary pressure. So as far as the Planning Commission is concerned, our effort is to increase the capability of the economy to grow by expanding the supply side potential. That will almost certainly lead to better inflation performance than otherwise.
So fiscal deficit, it has been expanded largely. IMF said that we have a dubious distinction of being the third largest fiscal deficit. We have more fiscal deficit than Spain and Greece.
Let me say, that's true that our fiscal deficit is high. Finance Minister has recognized that. That's why he set up the Kelkar committee to try. to bring it down. But you know, don't be over carried away by the comparison, because whereas our fiscal deficit is higher than that of Spain or Greece, our debt to GDP ratio is much lower. I mean, we have a debt to GDP ratio of maybe 70-something%, whereas those countries have debt to GDP ratio of 100% and 120%. Secondly, our growth rate is much higher than those countries. So as a general rule, if your debt to GDP ratio is high and your growth potential is very low, then you should really not have any fiscal deficit at all. Ideally, you should be running what is called a primary surplus. If you are in an environment where your existing debt to GDP ratio is not too bad and your growth potential is high, then you can run a fiscal deficit, and preferably I think that fiscal deficit should be used to finance investment. So I think a simple comparison of fiscal deficits across countries may give the wrong impression. Having said all that, let me say that bottom line, where I agree with the IMF and Finance Minister agrees with the IMF, we must bring this deficit under control over a 3-year period. It's not something that you have to do instantly. And we are not in that sense in a crisis. But you know, sometimes you get a situation where you're in a crisis, you don't have any reserves, money is flying out, and whether you like it or not, you have to bring your fiscal deficit down. I don't think people are expecting that. But people are expecting us to provide a credible story that over the next 3 years or so, our fiscal deficit will come down.
So one of the key causes of a big fiscal deficit is subsidies. There's a clamor to reduce the subsidies. Now a direct cash subsidy has been introduced. How will it help in reducing the pilferage and all the inefficiencies associated with subsidies?
Well, direct cash transfer has not actually been introduced, but we are talking about it. You know, I think the key, one of the big advantages of shifting from a system of subsidies to a system of direct cash transfer is that the degree of leakage goes down very substantially. The reason for that is that a cash transfer is usually associated with an effort to identify the person in a manner which is quite unambiguous. Whereas, you know, when you're wandering around with a ration card, I mean, nobody bothers to check who's come in with a ration card. So if there are 10 people and 8 of them are not really intending to use the ration card, their ration card can be used to get subsidies. In a direct cash transfer, you will need a biometric identification so that one person will only get one subsidy, not many different subsidies. Now, this has been experimented with in Andhra Pradesh recently, not in terms of cash subsidies, but in terms of what happens in the distribution of subsidized goods when you introduce an Aadhaar-based verification. And they have found that earlier there were 30% leakage. 30% people were, of the distributed goods were being distributed to the same person using multiple cards. And that when they restricted it, that only the person with the card and the thumbprint can get it, the total offtake reduced sharply. Now, what this suggests is that there are people who need the subsidy, but there are too many people who are not eligible for the subsidy but who are claiming the subsidy. And I think that the introduction of the cash transfers will prevent that from happening. You know, it's also the case with, it's like if somebody's got a ration card and he doesn't particularly want to buy the product, he doesn't mind giving it to someone else and say, well, you collect it. But when it's a cash transfer, he won't be willing to do that. So I think both on the side of the beneficiary and generally, it will introduce much greater discipline and will stop leakage.
So for infrastructure, we need $1 trillion for next year, for next 5 years to develop the infrastructures. How will you get that money? You will get that money from private sector. How will you ask them?
Well, no, I think one of the areas where I believe our efforts have been quite successful in the last 10 years or so is in building infrastructure through PPP. Earlier, all infrastructure almost was being done through the public sector. In the last plan and even in the previous one, more PPP has been brought in. Now, in the 10th plan, PPP role was about 10%. In the 11th plan, we did much better for total infrastructure, and within that, the PPP role was about 35%. Now we are hoping that the PPP role will be 50%. So the 1 trillion is the number for 5 years. Half of that hopefully will come from PPP. The other half will have to come from the public sector itself.
So, but PPP models are usually plagued with some problems, inefficiencies. You've seen what happened with Delhi airport expressways. How will you deal with those
You know,
problems?
I want to mention this. It is what I think happens with the PPP, and that's good, that the moment there's a problem, because they're involved, I mean, people want to make sure that, you know, the fellows are delivering what they're supposed to deliver, and it becomes news. These problems exist in the public sector also. I mean, if you look at public sector projects, huge cost overruns, time overruns, they don't make the news because that is treated as business as usual. Whenever you have a PPP project, any departure from what was agreed to or anything that causes a problem makes news. I'm not saying that the PPPs don't have problems, but all I'm trying to say is it's completely wrong. PPPs have problems and the other mode doesn't. Both of them have problems. On the whole, I think if you go to the Delhi airport, whatever you may say, it's a well-functioning airport and symbolically seems to indicate. I can guarantee you that we'd never have been able to invest that much money if we were relying entirely on the public sector. And it's not very clear to me that it would have been built in time. I mean, Kolkata and Chennai are being done by the airport authority and they're delayed. Hopefully they're going to finish soon. So, you know, I think if we had tried to do that many airports entirely by the airports authority, I'm almost certain that we would not have succeeded. So doing both is a good idea.
So you were in Tokyo last week. How are investors taking India's new reform agenda?
Oh, I think the new reforms have been very greatly welcomed. I think they see that as a signal that the government of India is not complacent, that the government of India knows that the economy has slowed down. I should say, by the way, that abroad, people are also aware that other economies have slowed down. You know, even the IMF's numbers, if you take, I personally think the IMF is understating it, but even if you look at the IMF numbers of 4.9, the numbers for Russia, the number for Brazil, the number of most other countries is much lower. Only China is better than us, and they've always been a faster growing country. So I think globally, people now are they're viewing the latest efforts with very positively. Of course, they're saying, well, look, this is a start, and they hope that this will continue. And we are telling them that we are aware that this is a start and more has to be done.
So Eurozone is back in the news. The IMF and World Bank have said the Eurozone policy implementation should take place. How much potential the Eurozone crisis has to affect India's growth?
Well, you know, I think all countries, and certainly India now, are much more globally integrated. So any global crisis will affect everybody. It will affect us too. My own feeling, by the way, is that the likelihood of a Eurozone crisis is now much less. You know, I think in the Eurozone, there used to be two concerns. One is that they are not willing to take the action needed to protect the euro. And if there was a collapse of the euro, or if the Eurozone actually broke down, there would be huge financial uncertainty. I think that today the position is that people realize that they are going to protect the euro. What is not clear is whether they're going to take the policies needed to bring back rapid growth. So I think we should, in one sense, I think the news is better than it looked like 4 months ago, because I think the Eurozone countries have clearly indicated that they're going to back the euro. What is not so good is the evidence as to whether they'll be doing the things necessary to get back to 2% growth, or whether they'll just have something between 0 and 1%. At the moment, that is the focus which the IMF is emphasizing. There's not enough to get back good growth.
Thanks so much to talking to DD News, sir. That was the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, talking exclusively to DD News. Last week we saw a threat of a rating downgrade by S&P.
I do not think that there is a case for a downgrade.